We're all here today to discuss how districts can examine their own data to assess how often they're using exclusionary disciplinary actions, and particularly for minor student offenses, whether policies or practices for addressing such infractions appear to be targeted towards certain types of students, and then also how these various disciplinary actions might correlate with academic outcomes. They're important questions, questions that Anthony brought up here. But before we dive into the specific approaches to analyzing the data to examine the questions, there's some things that folks should consider and spend some time reviewing data to make the appropriate selections for the types of analyses you want to use. This review might include several considerations. There's actually a nice checklist of guiding questions in the report on page 5 and include questions such as, are the behaviors and disciplinary actions clearly defined? Do you know what your population of interest is or your unit of analysis? Are there defined rules for making sure that you're being transparent in your analysis, dealing with missing data appropriately or perhaps inaccurate data? And what is your process for checking the accuracy of the data and data entry process? And then also, what's your process or procedure for making sure that any potentially identifiable data is sufficiently suppressed so that we're not releasing data accidentally that would identify any students, specific students. So I'm going to walk through a few of the methods for completing these data checks here today, and I also point you to the report that includes in the appendix a much lengthier and detailed list of approaches for data checks for disciplinary data. But to start, let's define what we're talking about when we're referencing disciplinary action. It's defined many ways. Here we're looking at exclusionary and inclusionary discipline. Discipline in schools can be categorized as exclusionary actions which remove students from their normal learning setting. So an example would be out-of-school suspensions. Or inclusionary actions which do not. That might be after-school detention or some other alternative. In-school suspension might be considered exclusionary or inclusionary because it still may result in that loss of learning time for the student. You can see in the report on page 2 and 3 an extensive list of definitions for these terms and others. But what's important here is the districts really should clearly define what their disciplinary actions are and how they relate to specific behavioral incidents, and whether those actions are defined as exclusionary or inclusionary in order to fully analyze your disciplinary data. So there's really a wide range of student offenses for which they might be subject to disciplinary action. There's non-discretionary offenses that might require a very specific disciplinary action. For example, physical violence between students, fighting, or verbal threats. They might carry a very specific consequence or disciplinary action. But there are also these other types of offenses considered discretionary and are often categorized by these vague descriptors. So you can see in the table on the slide here, these are various ways districts within our Urban School Alliance define disrespect, defiance, and other kind of subjective student offenses. So you can see there's quite a variety here. The fact that these are subjective really allows for a lot of flexibility in how discipline is applied, but that flexibility in how discipline is applied to these offenses might also lead to the disproportionate use of discipline. So careful analysis of disciplinary data might unearth the frequency by which these offenses are met with various types of discipline, and whether there are certain student subgroups disciplined more often than others for these subjective offenses. Okay. So we'll switch gears here and talk a little bit about the things you need in a data file in order to conduct the analyses that we're going to present here and that are presented in the REL report. The analyses that will follow here assume that you're working with what is called a flat file. Districts might extract disciplinary data from different sources or multiple data tables within the same data system. This is often what's referred to as relational data coming from different sources. A flat file assumes that all the data are contained within the same file and that each row of data represents a single student and each column represents a single student variable, such as a single offense or resulting disciplinary action. When you're creating your flat file, you should really be thinking about your unit of analysis that you plan to use in your work. In this case, we're talking about student-level data, where each student is represented in a row, and that could be aggregated up to other levels, such as the school or the district. Once you have your flat file in place, it's time to start doing some of those data checks that we talked about a little while ago. So in addition to applying explicit definitions to all data elements in your analyses, and that includes the disciplinary actions, such as exclusionary and inclusionary, it's also important to establish some rules to make the analysis transparent. The rules might include how you define the population in your analysis or how you handle students who may have dropped out during the year or moved away from the district. Once you're clear on the data elements that are necessary and the rules that will guide the analysis, it's then important to confirm the extent and reasons for missing or potentially inaccurate data. So for example, there might be data that's not entered into the system at all. Now the issue with this is it provides an incomplete picture of offenses and discipline and can lead to misinterpretation of the data or potentially underestimates the frequency of either student offenses or the resulting disciplinary action. You also might come across data that's either collected or recorded incorrectly. Disciplinary data that can be incorrectly recorded if there's a wrong code for an offense that's used, or perhaps when data are copied in inaccurately from a paper form into the computer, and also when open-ended data are coded into discrete categories. So it's really important to do those data checks in the file that you have, and also talk with your colleagues and stakeholders that are entering the data into the system to identify potential areas for these issues with missing and inaccurate data. And then finally, again, it's important to establish the unit of analysis and ensure that the data is reported in a way that does not lead to potentially identifiable data. An analyst interested in the number of suspensions in a school might use suspensions as the unit of analysis. Those interested in the number of students who are suspended would use the student as the unit analysis, and those would require two different data files. It really depends on what you're interested in. So the former is interested in the number of suspensions without regard for the number of students, while the latter is focused on the student, and each student is counted just once in the analysis regardless of the number of suspensions they receive. This is often referred to as unduplicated counts. So regardless of the unit of analysis, analysts will grapple with how to handle incidents with multiple offenses. So you might think of two students who are fighting, but then someone might be caught with a possession of a drug or something like that as part of the incident. How do we count that? Is it that there are two offenses for fighting and drugs? And how is that recorded within the data file? A common strategy is to count the incident only once and include the most serious offense within any incident that has multiple offenses. Again, you can refer to Appendix B of the report, which has an extensive set of data checks to help you further reduce the potential for error in your analyses. These include reviewing the coding and syntax for your analyses, making sure that you cross-check your disciplinary data and enrollment data between general education and special education students to be sure that things are being reported consistently across populations. And also take a look at the student identifiers in your file and make sure to reconcile any duplicate names, birth dates, anything like that to make sure you have accurate data on your students. There's a number of other suggestions, again, in Appendix B of the report.